Portland's Friday Forum. Today is Friday, July 22nd. I'm Charity Fain, Executive Director of City Club, and I'm pleased to have you with us today, both the members and guests who join us here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today, we are delighted to welcome attorney Stephen Goldberg, who will discuss the Tunisian Revolution and its repercussions. But before our program begins, we have a few announcements. To begin, out of respect of our guests and speakers, please silence your cell phones. City Club's corporate and media partners are essential to the vitality and sustainability of club activities. I'd like to thank our generous media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and offer our deep appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors. Please thank me in joining communications firm Morel Inc., utility company Northwest National, and the law firms of Perkins Coie and Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt. We are grateful for your support and commitment to the City Club mission. If your company or firm would like to support the club's mission through the sponsorships, please contact me or other City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. City Club today would also like to thank the World Affairs Council of Oregon for co-sponsoring this program. The World Affairs Council strives to broaden public awareness and understanding of international affairs and to engage Oregonians with the world. You will learn more about their website at www.worldoregon.org and in their newsletter at the front table. In addition to our usual member questions, we'll be taking index card questions during today's question and answer period. During the forum, we invite you to write questions that you have for our speaker on the index cards that are on your table. You do not need to be a City Club member to submit a question. During the board host question, City Club staff will collect these cards and pick the best question, which I will then read from the microphone. City Club members and World Affairs Council members today are welcome to come to the microphone and ask their questions during the Q&A. We're absolutely sure you'll come up with some great questions. And now on to our program. Since January 2011, Tunisia has taken center stage as the country whose revolution triggered a wave of revolt that swept through the Arab world and beyond. The Jasmine Revolution, a sudden and explosive wave of street protests, ousted Tunisian President Ben Ali, an authoritarian leader whose repressive rule lasted 23 years, forcing him to flee the country. Today, our speaker will discuss the conditions and events that led to the downfall of the Ben Ali regime, how this change happened so rapidly, and the implications for future U.S. relations with Tunisia in their journey toward democracy. A Harvard Law School graduate, Stephen Goldberg has practiced law in Oregon since 1975. He opened his own law firm in 2006, where he focuses on civil litigation and the representation of labor unions and working people. He has helped prisoners contest medical and mental health conditions in the Eastern Oregon Correctional Institution and has represented an Oregon National Guardsman in his challenge to the U.S. Army's stop-loss policy, which involuntarily extended military enlistments sending soldiers to Iraq and Afghanistan. This past spring, Stephen was part of an international delegation of lawyers who visited Tunisia at the invitation of the Tunisian National Bar Association. There, the delegation met with representatives of the interim government, as well as human rights organizations, leaders of major opposition parties, and young people who had facilitated the revolution through the use of social media. We look forward to hearing more about this visit, so without further ado, please help me welcome Stephen Goldberg to the podium.
So one would never have chosen Tunisia as the country which would have sparked the change in protests which have spread across the Middle East since December of last year. Europeans knew about Tunisia primarily as a tourist destination because of its beaches, And if Americans knew anything about Tunisia, I expect it primarily would have been because of its location for the filming of a classic movie. Do you all know what I'm talking about? I don't hear. Not The English Patient. Star Wars. Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie was filmed in Tunisia. So Tunisia is in North Africa. It's bordered on the west by Algeria and on the east by Libya. It got its independence from France in 1956. Its first president, Habib Bourguiba, ruled until 1987, and then Ben Ali became president and ruled until 2011. Let me tell you a very little bit about it. It's a relatively small country. Its population is about 10.4 million people. It relies primarily on textiles and tourism, but has a very large unemployment rate, 14% in the cities at this point, and it's much larger if you go into the rural areas. Its tourist industry really was pretty much devastated as a result of the political changes that began last December. As compared to countries like Libya or Yemen, the population is more homogeneous. It's a pretty well-educated population. And although it is a majority Muslim population, it has a history of secular government. The women's movement has always been very important in Tunisia. And in fact, if you look at the government, most governments have had women involved in those governments. Now, the revolution itself was sparked by a street vendor, a fruit peddler in central Tunisia, in a city called Sidi Bouzid, setting himself on fire in a protest against the country's policies, political situation, and mostly against corruption. This was a guy who relied on permits to be able to sell his fruit. It became increasingly difficult to get those permits without paying money to various local officials to get the permit. Ultimately, he was denied a permit, his fruit was confiscated, he was humiliated by local officials, and was desperate enough to perform this act. Now, this was on December 17th of 2010, and in less than 1 month, the Ben Ali government fell, and Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia, where he still lives. So how did I end up in Tunisia? Obviously, there are a lot of organizations and individuals who do important human rights work in Portland and in Oregon, from the many lawyers who represented Guantanamo detainees to the great groups we have, such as Mercy Corps. I first became involved with this work through a legal organization I'm part of called the National Lawyers Guild. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Guild, it's been around since 1936, and at that time was formed as an alternative to the American Bar Association, which would not allow African Americans as members into the ABA. Since then, the Guild has been involved in a lot of progressive issues nationally, and we have a chapter in Portland. But the Guild has also always had a strong international presence, and through the Guild, I have participated in delegations beginning in the mid-90s to South Africa, to Cuba, and in early 2000, I was in Israel and Palestine on a couple of different occasions. So it was through my work and international work through the Lawyers Guild that I was invited, and another attorney in Portland, Tom Nelson, and we were asked to join what became a delegation of about 13 attorneys, which included a couple of attorneys from the United States, several attorneys from the United Kingdom, and also attorneys from Turkey, as well as also some academics from England. The delegation actually was conceived by an activist, political activist who was living in London, who was Tunisian, and who had been exiled from the country when he was young, in his teens, and had not been able to return to Tunisia for about 20 years. So he went to the country immediately after the revolution in January and decided that it was really important that other people get to this country as quickly as possible. We had contacts again with international lawyers, and then we ultimately received a formal invitation from the National Bar Association of Tunisia to come to the country, and the group of us were there in March of this year. So what were the purposes of this delegation? We really had, I think, three basic purposes. Number one, we wanted to just see what had happened, to learn and better understand how this revolution could have happened so quickly in such a short period of time. Number two, we wanted to show support and solidarity for the Tunisian people. A lot of Westerners, and particularly people from the US, had not been in the country at that point. And finally, we wanted to get a better understanding of the role of the West, and certainly the Americans wanted to get a better sense of the role of the United States during the Ben Ali regime, and how the US could be most constructive in terms of helping Tunisia make this transition to democracy. So what do you do on one of these delegations? We're only there for about 13 days. Our goal was to meet as large a cross-section of the population as possible. So I'll give you a sense of who we met with. We met with government officials. We met with the Prime Minister, the Minister of Justice, the Interior, representatives of the Interior Ministry, and the chairperson of the Transitional Constitutional Commission set up in Tunisia, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So all of those people had been appointed as basically the transitional government, and that was great fun going into the main palace, like the White House equivalent or Congress equivalent, and meeting some of these people. Although the meetings with the government officials we found probably were the least productive of our meetings. So the second category of people we met with is what I would call the important players in this revolution. It included human rights organizations and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, most of which had been declared illegal under the Ben Ali regime. We met with lawyers. We met with labor leaders, both labor leaders from individual unions as well as the National Labor Federation. It's kind of similar to our AFL-CIO. And we met with leaders from several of the political parties, which again had all been declared illegal. We met with, in particular, leaders from the Communist Party and from the party called Ennahda. Ennahda is really the major political party in Tunisia and is the Muslim party, the party that represents most of the Muslims in the country. We also met with young people, and we'll talk a little bit more about the role of young people in this revolution, but we tried to meet with young people who were students, who were bloggers, who were the ones who used social media, and we'll talk about that. We met with the political and economic counselor at the United States Embassy. And the interesting point about that meeting is, of all of the meetings we had in Tunisia, and of all of the meetings we had, that was the only meeting where the rules were set beforehand that it was off the record. So technically, I'm not allowed to talk about specifically what was said during that meeting. We also met, and perhaps this was the most fascinating part of the trip, with political prisoners in Tunisia. And these were primarily men in their 40s, some in their 50s, who had been imprisoned for the last 10, 15, 20 years of their lives. This included one of the Tunisians, his name is Mohammed al-Haji, who had been detained in Guantanamo for 5.5 years, who was released from Guantanamo, I believe it was in 2009, back to Tunisia, where he was immediately rearrested and spent another 1.5 years in the Tunisian jail before he was finally released in January of this year under what was called a general amnesty. We went to one of the first things we did when we arrived in Tunisia, we went to a massive rally of political prisoners. It was kind of the celebration of people who had been released. And there was family member after family member who would come to the podium and talk about their family members who were still missing or who had been killed over the last 20 years. And seeing the people who had been in jail, in prison all of these years, and who talked not about bitterness. They weren't looking back at what had happened to them, but were all, to a person, looking forward as to what would be happening in Tunisia. We also went to the central part of Tunisia where the demonstrations had first begun. And then the final thing we did is we had a lot of what I would call unplanned and kind of spontaneous visits, mostly with people who were demonstrating. There were demonstrations and we were in Tunisia a couple of months after the revolution. There were at least 2 or 3 demonstrations going on every day. You would walk through the main avenue, which is where our hotel was located, and there would be a demonstration one day against protesting the low wages of civil servants. We were there when Secretary of State Clinton was visiting Tunisia, and there were often anti-US demonstrations there. And we would, of course, readily join the demonstrations and very openly would talk about being Americans, and people embraced us. And like one of the first demonstrations we were at, the sign was, USA kills Tunisian people. So we honed in on the sign and talked to the people at the demonstration. And what they were talking about, and they had these tear gas canisters that had been used against demonstrators in January. And those tear gas canisters showed that they had been made actually in various cities, mostly in Pennsylvania, it seemed. And they wanted us to see what had happened with these tear gas canisters. And you think about tear gas canisters as being relatively innocuous, they just create tear gas. But the way that they're thrown, they in fact did, they're metal missiles, and some people were killed as a result of these canisters. So that gives you a sense of what so as you can tell, we had a fairly busy 13 days when we were in Tunisia. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, give you a short sense of how Ben Ali kind of kept his power going for 20 years. And then I want to talk about kind of the lessons we learned, or I learned, from this delegation. So in countries like Tunisia, after their emergence from colonial rule, there were various movements trying to define what the country was going to look like. There were certainly leftists, parties that were, don't ask me the differences, that were anti-colonialist or anti-imperialist. There were communist parties, there were socialist parties. Then you had what I would call the national Islamist parties, parties like Ennahda, which were more democratic, which believed in a democratic state and believed in a secular state and were committed to that, although their religious principles were very much important to them and they wanted to see those nonetheless reflected in the state. But then you also had the much more religious Islamists, the ones who believed that ultimately the country should become a religious state. Now, all of these people were subject to attack, both during the Bourguiba government, the first prime minister, and certainly during Ben Ali's regime, as Tunisia essentially was a one-party state. Any dissent was simply not tolerated. But then when communism fell in the early 1990s, one target was lost, the leftists to some extent, and it's the Islamists who really became the primary target of the regime. Now that was true throughout the time that Ben Ali was in power. Again, he became empowered in 1987. But the intensity of those attacks increased dramatically after September 11th. So dictators like Ben Ali saw September 11th as an opportunity, primarily as an opportunity to continue to receive aid from the West, and particularly from the United States, and also to increase the amount of that aid. So I'm not going to bore you with too many figures, but let me give you some sense of what we're talking about. Again, Tunisia is a small country. Between 1987 and 2009, US military aid to Tunisia totaled about $349 million. But that did not include what was called Section 1206 aid. And this was aid that was created after September 11th and was specifically aid which was supposed to be used for anti-terrorist activities. So in 2008, Tunisia received another $10 million of Section 1206 aid. In 2009, about another $9 million, and this is on top of the normal military aid that was going to the country. Again, not a huge amount of money, but don't forget, Tunisia is a fairly small population. So, how is this aid used? Now, the problem Ben Ali had was that there wasn't a lot of terrorism going on in Tunisia. Al-Qaeda wasn't operating in Tunisia as far as anybody knew. There were certainly extremists, some extremists in Tunisia, but there was nothing like what you would imagine in terms of what was going on in other countries, going on in Tunisia. So what Ben Ali decided, and we learned this from most of the young men that we had met with, was that if you were Muslim, and if you were at all religious, if you went to the mosque on a regular basis, if you were a young person and were a member of an Islamic student association in the university, you would be arrested. We heard so many different stories of young people, and think of, I have, at this point my son is 29 years old, but think of him when he was 18 years old, which is how old most of these kids were. Kids, I say, when they were yanked from their families, yanked from their schools, and were arrested, detained without any charge, and without the families knowing where they were, without being allowed to see lawyers, and then were subject to torture. What activities have you been involved in? What are your friends doing? And then months later, they would be brought before a court complaining about the torture, but judges were instructed not to note, was the word we heard, that they had been tortured, not to write that down, not to let that be part of the record. And then they would be sentenced for another 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years, or more in prison. We spoke to two leaders of this, again, major political party. It's like the heads of the Democratic Party or Republican Party in this country, who were amazing people. They were like very, very intelligent, articulate, thoughtful people. One who'd been in prison for 14 years, one who'd been in prison for 17 and a half years. Some people were tried before military courts, some before ordinary criminal courts. Confessions were extracted under torture, and those confessions were used as evidence. And then the definition of torture was broadened. In 2003, a new law was enacted in Tunisia at the encouragement of the United States, which was helping to draft these laws in various countries in the Middle East. And the anti-terrorism law very much expanded the definition of what terrorism was. Pretrial detention without any kind of court review was broadened. So all of this was going on after September 11th. And again, you can hear somebody talk about it and you can think about it, but we've seen pictures of people in Abu Ghraib. We've heard about things that happened at least in the early years in Guantanamo. The stories that people told about torture, were really, really horrendous stories. And you just can't underestimate what impact that has on individuals. And we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about that impact as I go on. Ben Ali also controlled, so we're talking again, how did he consolidate his power? He controlled a lot of the societal institutions. So the military was not controlled directly by Ben Ali, but the police were, and then there was a separate kind of secret police force set up by him. He controlled the media. All of the media was controlled by the government in Tunisia. The courts were basically controlled by the government. If decisions were rendered that were not in sympathy with the courts, judges were removed. The labor federations were to some extent not controlled and to some extent accommodated to the Ben Ali regime. So we met with several people who had been part of this National Tunisian Labor Federation. And what they explained is that representatives of Ben Ali's political party were on the federation as well. So if the federation became too left in any of its demands, too political in any of its demands, those labor leaders would be removed or imprisoned. So you don't blame them for having accommodated to the government. They really had no choice. They were allowed to push economic demands in the country. So as long as the unions were out there demanding wages, that was okay. But when they crossed into the political realm, that would not be tolerated. And again, a lot of these institutions basically said, okay, we'll go ahead and do what we need to do to survive under the Ben Ali regime. And the final thing, the final way in which Ben Ali really consolidated power is he had a lot of money. A lot of the foreign aid that went to Tunisia ended up in Ben Ali's pockets and in the pockets of his family. A lot of the structural economic adjustments that happened as a result of Western countries, the World Bank, the IMF, calling for such things as privatization. That began in the 1980s, continued in the 1990s, when these industries, like when utility companies, which had all been nationalized in Tunisia, were privatized. A lot of that money did not go into government coffers, it went into Ben Ali's pocket. So that's what he did, I think, and how he was able to stay in power for so long. So, what changed? So the first lesson, there are two primary lessons I think I gained from this delegation. The first lesson is understanding the importance of mass movements to political change. Now, under Ben Ali, there had been many groups that had been struggling for change. As I said, there were human rights organizations, there were NGOs who were incredibly brave in terms of voicing opposition to the government. Even a lot of the labor groups and unions would voice that kind of opposition. Even lawyers were voicing opposition to what was happening in the courts. But generally, it was very difficult because of the repressive nature of the regime for them to really, for them to be able to sustain the protests that we did. But then stuff slowly began to change. In 2005, several of the political parties, there was a meeting, a clandestine meeting of the political parties, and they formed an agenda to say that we need to work together on certain principles to be able to change this country. So for example, what did they do? Ennahda, at that point, the Muslim party, agreed as part of those principles that they would only push for a secular state in Tunisia. On the other hand, parties like the Communist Party, who had no particular interest in religion and didn't want that in any way to be part of their platform, they agreed that they would not push for the kinds of legislation that you see in France, which prohibits women from having headscarves, walking in the streets. So you saw that the political parties in Tunisia, again, all illegal, were trying to work out platforms together, trying to figure out what they could agree to in terms of working for change. There was also then in 2008, so that was in 2005. In 2008, there was a major strike in southern Tunisia among the miners. Now, what had happened is that the government and the mining company basically controlled who could get these really good jobs in the mines in southern Tunisia. And a lot of miners who weren't paying the money to get the jobs objected to that and began to actually start some demonstrations in 2008, which were supported by the local labor unions in that part of the country. Not by the National Federation, but they were supported by the local labor unions. And there were actually demonstrations which were brutally repressed by the government. And word of that repression began to get out through the country. And people began to see that something was going on in Tunisia. But there is no question that what galvanized the events in December and January were young people taking to the streets, first in the rural parts of Tunisia, and then very quickly spreading to Tunis, which is the capital city. And what do I mean by these demonstrations? It's not like, we have a big demonstration in Portland against the war, against Afghanistan, our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we work and we have a demonstration on a Saturday, and then everybody goes home and there's not another demonstration for 6 months or a year or whatever. In Tunisia, what was happening was that people were taking to the streets morning, noon, and night, day after day after day. They were unemployed. They were students, and the most important part of this, what we've heard a lot about, and what I think Mark Pritchard and I have been talking about, is they used social media to organize and spread information. So I'm looking out, and I see we have a relatively older group of people here today, no insult intended, but what people told us in Tunisia, and I think the best phrase that I ever heard, was that their mobile devices were the Gutenberg presses of their generation. And really what was happening was that Twitter and texting and primarily Facebook became the main organizing tool for protests and for sharing videos. So for example, when the demonstrations began in Tunisia, in the central part of Tunisia, people could take pictures of those on their cell phones, could take videos of those on their cell phones, post those then on the internet, and other people throughout Tunisia could see what was happening. Social media was used to tell people where protests were going to be happening. Join us at such and such a street at such and such a time. They told people where not to go. Don't go to this street because the police are forming in that street. The government was putting out a lot of rumors that water was being poisoned or whatever. Social media and websites and blogs could be used to tell people, don't show up. And it was really interesting talking to the young people. Particularly we met with a group of young women who had been blogging for several years, and their blogs had really been used initially to explore their femininity and their feminism and sexuality. That's what a lot of their blogs were being used to. But very quickly, those blogs became political blogs. There's an interesting professor at NYU. His name is Clay Shirky. And he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs earlier this year where he tried to explore this whole idea of the use of social media. And it actually created some controversy. Malcolm Gladwell, who's a writer for The New Yorker, kind of responded and took the position social media wasn't that important. But Shirky basically said, and I think this strikes home to what I saw in Tunisia, that what all of these cell phones and Twitter and Facebook allowed people to do is it allowed people who were previously dispersed and disconnected from one another to synchronize their opinions, to coordinate their actions, and then to document the results. And that's exactly what we saw. Now you ask, why didn't the government block it? We heard that when this happened in Egypt, the government turned off the internet. I'm not sure how you turn off the internet, but they did turn off the internet. And I think what happened in Tunisia is, again, Tunisia was the first country this started to happen in. I think the government was just caught totally by surprise. They had no idea that this was going to happen. They weren't quite sure how to block the internet. What they did begin to do was try to figure out where these websites were coming from, to try to trace the people who had Facebook accounts. And some of the young people, it was really interesting, told us that they had spoken, and I haven't verified this, but spoke to the Facebook people in California who helped them figure out ways of making their Facebook pages more secure. So it was really, really an interesting thing to see. Now, as these demonstrations grew, Other more established groups fairly quickly saw that they better join in this movement, that there really was a potential for real change here. And most importantly, I think labor and the Labor Federation joined in the demonstrations, but not right away. Initially, for example, the Labor Federation was not demanding that Ben Ali be removed from power. But as particularly the local unions began to say, no, that's our demand, and as the young people and everyone else were saying, that's our demand, then labor joined in, and that became very important. Various strikes were called, and a general strike for the whole country was called, actually on the day that Ben Ali resigned. I'll take some pride in the fact that lawyers in early January went on strike, and the courts were closed down, initially in protest of beatings by the police. But it was great to see lawyers because it's like in England, they wear those gowns with the white bibs, and they don't wear the wigs. But it was great to see all these lawyers in the street. You saw that actually in other countries as well. In Pakistan, when Musharraf was removed from power, lawyers were very important during that demonstration. So it was great to see lawyers out there. And the other factor I think that was very important was that the military did not get involved. That, as in Egypt, the military chose not to repress the demonstrators. So that's what you saw in Tunisia. And I guess I want to bring it home for a minute to ask us to think about our country. Now, we have gone through probably the worst recession in any of our lifetimes. I'm looking at my financial advisor who's sitting here and who we went through that together. But it's been an amazing time over the last couple of years where people have been out of work, not for weeks and not for months, but literally for years, where people's homes are being foreclosed daily. It's still happening in Oregon on a regular basis, where Wall Street firms and banks are recording record profits nonetheless and continuing to pay very large bonuses. And where, and I heard this on NPR last week, there was the disparity between rich and poor, and actually between the rich and the middle class, is continuing to widen in this country, really as never before. So the question you have to ask is, why haven't we seen the kinds of mass demonstrations that have been taking place in the Middle East happening in the United States? And I don't have an answer for that, but I'll leave you with that question. But I'll also leave you with this one little anecdote. One of the signs that you saw in Tunisia, which were very, very important during the demonstration, was a sign that said, Ben Ali dégagé. So the primary language in Tunisia is Arabic, but everyone pretty much speaks French as well. And Ben Ali dégagé means Ben Ali, go away. And those signs were everywhere during the demonstrations. I noticed when I was watching the demonstrations that were happening in Wisconsin several months later against the anti-union legislation which had been enacted in that state, that there were a couple of people who held signs that said, Governor Walker dégagé. So to some extent, and seriously, you begin to see perhaps some of the lessons of the Tunisian Revolution. So the last thing I want to focus on is the role of the United States. So when we met with various US people, not saying specifically what happened in my meeting with the embassy, the US, I think, insists and will tell you that it consistently took the position of criticizing the political situation in Tunisia over the years. They will tell you that every year the State Department puts out what are called country-by-country reports. And if you looked at the country reports of Tunisia, they would criticize the Ben Ali regime. We were told that the embassy had met with opposition political parties. They met with representatives of Ennahda, and they had met with a couple of the human rights organizations. We were told that when Ben Ali won his election in 2009, he expected a letter of congratulations from President Obama. And when that letter wasn't forthcoming, the government officials actually called the embassy and said, "Where's our letter of congratulations?" And they were told, there will be no letter of congratulations. So the embassy people said, "What more did you want from us?" But the problem was that whenever we spoke to the Tunisian people, everyone we met, to a T, was critical of the US's role in Tunisia. And of course, the first answer we would get would be, how could you have been complicit with the Ben Ali regime? How could you, all of these years, been sending him the money which allowed him to imprison us and torture and repress our children? That was how the Tunisian people at least looked at the role of the United States. The other thing, it was almost like there was this trinity of answers we would get when we would talk to people about US involvement. And they would say the reason we are criticizing the US is, number one, because of your involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, number two, because of Guantanamo, and number three, because of your unconditional support for Israel. And whoever we met with, those were the three things that would always come up. Now, the WikiLeaks documents in December, some of the WikiLeaks documents that were disclosed were cables between the embassy in Tunis and the US State Department in Washington, D.C. And those WikiLeaks documents were also relied on very much and referred to a lot by the Tunisian people because they made clear that the US understood not only the political repression, but also the corruption of the Ben Ali regime. And it's really interesting to look at those documents. They're all available online. If you just Google WikiLeaks Tunisia, you'll get to those documents. There were some really interesting documents, particularly about when President Obama was elected. And there was this sense of things are really going to change. This is the embassy reporting to the State Department. People in Tunisia feel things will change because President Obama will end our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, because he has said he is going to close Tunisia, and because he said he's going to make bringing peace in the Middle East a major focus of his administration. But nonetheless, those documents said we should still tone down our criticism of the Ben Ali regime, at least publicly. If anything, the sense of reading those documents was they felt that the Bush administration had been too vocal in criticizing the Ben Ali regime, and that the Obama administration should maybe do more indirect criticism of the regime. Now, obviously, the rationale of Western nations is that they have to act in a way which furthers their own economic and political and national security interests, but at the same time supports the ideals that these nations espouse. And I've often heard President Obama described as somebody who talks like an idealist, but who acts like a realist. And I'm not sure if there's anything wrong with that. But certainly what Tunisia tells us is that the people in these countries will no longer tolerate the contradictory conduct of Western countries. We cannot, on the one side of our mouth, talk about the importance of democracy, and then out of the other side of our mouth, support the governments which make a mockery of democratic principles. And this attitude is not unique to Tunisia. And there was I just want to refer very briefly, there was an article by fellow Oregonian Nicholas Kristof on July 3rd in the New York Times, where he talks about talking to a pro-democracy writer and activist in Mauritania, and where the person says that the United States supports Mauritania partly because its military fights al-Qaeda, but it is the Mauritania's government's oppression, corruption, and economic incompetence that actually drive people to al-Qaeda. The United States plays into the hands of al-Qaeda when it supports undemocratic governments. The real stability is democracy. Okay, so I think I'm almost at the end of what I'm saying here. The final point I guess I'll leave you with is how does the US then repair this situation? And I think after Secretary of State Clinton's visit, she talked about giving $20 million to Tunisia in terms of helping them transition to democracy. And I think the final lesson that I'll leave you with is that I think it's very important that Western nations, governments like the United States, do that we support the transition. But at the same time, we have to be very, very careful that the aid we give, whether it's economic aid or political aid, that it not be perceived by the Tunisian people as simply another form of Western control. What those people want is for us to respect them, to accord them the dignity that they believe they deserve because of the actions and the risks and all that they have accomplished. They don't need us to tell them how to make democracy. They need for us to listen to them, to learn from them as they are making that transition to democracy, and to support it as much as possible. Much more to talk about. I'm at the end of my time, though. I will say this. If you want more information, the delegation that I was on did write a very lengthy report, and you can get more information, and you can actually see that report. It's online. If you Google the National Lawyers Guild International Committee, you'll find a link to that report. And I do want to thank very much the City Club and the World Affairs Council, and particularly Judge Mary Wyatt for getting me to speak here. So my final statement will simply be, look, this is a very fragile time in the Middle East and in a country like Tunisia. This is not going to be a linear, perfect transition to democracy. There are going to be a lot of ups and downs, a lot of things which scare us, and a lot of things which we will be able to support. But it is an incredibly exciting time. I never thought in my lifetime that it was like being in the middle of the Revolutionary War, being somewhere where people were so excited about making this kind of change. And we as Americans really need to embrace this and to figure out how best to support it. So thank you very much.
Before I introduce our Friday Forum host, if you have written a question on an index card, now is the time to hold it up so that City Club staff can collect it from you. The first question of our speaker will be from our Friday Forum host, City Club Governor Mac Prichard. Mac Prichard is the founder and president of Prichard Communications, a public relations and social media firm that serves foundations, nonprofits, and public agencies across the country. Mac joined the City Club in 2004, served on the Agora Committee for 2 years, and joined the Board of Governors in 2010. Mac?
Thank you, Charity, and thank you, Steve, for those insightful remarks. Steve, you talked about how the government under President Ben Ali controlled the traditional media, and the value of social media in helping organize the protests and the eventual overthrow of President Ben Ali. How has the traditional media changed since his departure, and how are people using, interest groups using social media now in this transition to democracy?
That's a great question. I think that the journalists that we met, I mean, they understood how the rest of the world was operating. They see CNN, they see Al Jazeera, which is very, very important in countries like Tunisia. So they understood what a good journalist should be. They just were under this repression. I think since then, from what we've been able to see in checking websites of some of the papers in Tunisia, there's been a blossoming, I think, of information. And one of the really good things that the United States, through the USAID, the Agency for International Development, has done, and the embassy has done, is they've organized, I think, a series of workshops bringing media people together. And these are video, I think, workshops, so they'll have people in Washington, D.C. and in other countries talk to and do like kind of webinars with the media in Tunisia. So I think it won't be hard for that media to transition to becoming a really good, free, and blossoming media. The question is going to be where the money is going to come from to support the media. Because the danger, as we know in this country, and maybe as we've thought a lot about this week, is that our media is generally controlled by certain conglomerates right now. And is that a surprise to anyone here? Did I say something shocking? Goodbye, Rupert Murdoch, perhaps, but we'll see. So the real key is going to be how to get money to make sure that the media can survive in a country which is really economically stressed at this point.
We will now take questions from the floor. As always, members and World Affairs Council members are invited to the microphone to ask their question. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member or World Affairs Council member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. And don't forget, if I flash the question mark, it means wrap up your presentation and ask a question. So, and I will ask one audience member, at least one audience member question once I get the cards.
David Margulis, member of City Club and World Affairs Council. When you met with the Prime Minister and the ministers of the other departments, were they from Ben Ali's old regime? And weren't they cronies of this old regime? And how pervasive is this revolution in the government and in the army or the institutions of the country besides the common people?
Also, really, really good question. Initially, there was a prime minister whose name was Ghannouchi. And Ghannouchi is the one who appointed the interim government at first. And the demonstrations which began happening almost immediately in the streets were that anyone affiliated with the old government had to be removed. So, for example, the first demonstrations were Ghannouchi, the prime minister, had to go, and he, in fact, did resign. And in fact, anyone now, at least in the upper levels of government, who is part of the old regime, has been forced out of, is not in this interim government at all. The problem is on the lower levels. So there were protests against judges when we were there, because a lot of the judges who had sentenced people to prison and who had been at least complicit in a lot of the torture were still deciding cases. So how do you get rid of all of the judges but still have a functioning judicial system? And nobody totally answered that question when we were there. There were some judges who resigned, some judges who were removed, but certainly on those levels, and if you go like into the Interior Ministry, there are still people who were part of the old regime. But at least whenever there have been a lot of demonstrations. Whenever anybody from the old regime was in any kind of position of real power, there would be demonstrations that they be removed, and they were removed. So people did seem to be responsive to that kind of, to that happening. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. You talked a little bit about the tension between U.S. national interests and U.S. values in terms of democracy. What influence do you believe your visit and your report will have on either changing that balance or influencing that balance?
Well, I'd like to report about my significant interest with the U.S. government, but I don't think I'm able to do that today. But more seriously, we have been in touch with a lot of the funding for Tunisia and for the Middle East countries goes through an agency called the Middle East Partnership Initiative. And we have been in contact with the people through email, through that agency, specifically wanting to know how the $20 million, which Secretary of State Clinton said would be used for Tunisia, how in fact it has been used. And at least at this point, so she was in Tunisia in March. We're now towards the end of July. I don't think any of that money has been spent yet. They have proposals out for people to submit grants as for how that money is going to be used, but none of that has been spent yet. So what we're trying to do now is follow up with those funding agencies to make sure that the money is used not in a way to undermine at least what's going on in Tunisia. And we are also trying to set up some meetings with congressional leaders in terms of distributing our report and talking about the findings of our commission. And they just have not been set up, at least to this point.
So I have a question from the floor. Populist movements that overthrow autocratic regimes often result in the creation of new autocratic regimes. Are you hopeful that we will see the creation of genuine liberal democracy with rule of law, or do you think there is the danger of a return to autocracy?
I'm hopeful but realistic. I think it would be very difficult to return to an autocratic kind of regime in Tunisia, at least in the immediate future. When we met with all of these different groups and people, we would ask the political parties, our real concern, what I didn't talk about, was how are you going to improve the economy in Tunisia? Because that's a real concern of how, whether or not groups like the World Bank and other organizations are going to try to influence that revolution in negative ways. So we would ask the parties, what are you going to do in terms of aid? Where are you going to go to for aid? And to a T, people's response was, you know, we haven't gotten there yet. We're so focused on making this democracy work. And I think that is the real focus of people right now. So it's hard to believe that, that the Tunisian people would allow an autocratic regime returning. But again, there's many more issues here. The real challenge, I think, is for the countries like, for the parties like Ennahda, the majority Muslim party, to resist the more radical elements in its party that are pushing more towards a religious state than a secular state. And how do you bring in a lot of the people who we met with, who were political prisoners, who are so cynical and so bitter about what had happened to them? How do you bring them into this new government and give them hope in terms of how this government can succeed? That's really the challenge in Tunisia. But ultimately, I am hopeful, which does not mean that, again, there aren't going to be hiccups along the way, and we should all understand that. But, you know, it's taken, how many years has our democracy been around? And we still have a few hiccups as well. So we should learn to expect that in the world.
Hello, my name is Cynthia Townsend. I'm a City Club member. And my question, I have a question for you that's sort of in response to your question for us about why don't these sort of vibrant mass political movements happen in the US even in a time of extreme financial depression. And do you think it has something to do with our rather naive, idealistic emphasis on the individual as a catalyst for change versus in societies in Africa and the Middle East, where the emphasis is more on the group, the family, the tribe, not the individual so much as an agent for change?
Well, it's a very thoughtful question. I often wonder, why is it in the United States that we have so much trouble with the idea of a national health insurance program when every other industrialized country in the world doesn't seem to have that same problem? And is it because of our rugged individualism or whatever? I have a son who's in graduate school right now and is kind of exploring this idea of individualism in the West and all of that. So, you know, I'm not sure. I mean, part of why people don't take to the streets more in this country is partly that people are so beaten down, are so desperate, are so, the whole question of media control in this country is really important, and it's something that we need to think about and more and more. The whole way our political parties are funded in this country is becoming less and less democratic thanks to the Supreme Court in this country. So there's a lot of challenges to our democracy. But at the same time, there are a lot of groups that are pushing for mass movements and for mass demonstrations in this country. Nationally, you saw what happened in Wisconsin In Portland, we have some great organizations like Jobs with Justice, if you don't know about them, that are doing demonstrations and trying to get people to work together. So I'm also hopeful that you're going to see more change in this country as well. My wife will be surprised at all this hopefulness I'm expressing, but that's how I do feel today.
I'm sorry, but we have run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week for our final summer forum to learn about what Portland is doing to revitalize the Rose Quarter. As we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's guest, Stephen Goldberg. We are adjourned.